Thank you, Zoom lady. Okay, so welcome to everybody who's already joined us, and to those of you still trickling in, good evening from London. This is a panel hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society on the topic of the politics of solidarity, Israel, Palestine, and the left. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion of this topic following the recent violence in Gaza and Israel. But we've now slightly after that, and hopefully we'll have a more reflective discussion on what this means for the state of the left today. The Platypus Affiliated Society, founded in 2006, hosts reading groups, panel discussions like this, journalism in the Platypus Review, and events on campuses around the world. We have chapters in America, Germany, Greece, Australia, Japan, the UK, and several other places. If you are interested in participating in a Platypus reading group or attending in-person events, teach-ins, coffee breaks, or panels like this one, you can find a chapter near you at our website, platypus1917.org. You can also check out our monthly open submission publication, the Platypus Review. And you can also find links to our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, which is available on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud. So I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us this evening. We have Arash Azizi of the Left Party of Iran, or People's Fedaian, Yoav Gal Tamir of Da'am Workers' Party, Marco from the Angry Workers' World, and Moshé Machover, who was one of the founding members of Matzpen and regularly writes for The Weekly Worker in the UK. So before we come to our speakers, I will just briefly read the description and questions that we sent them in preparation for their opening remarks. They will have around 10 minutes each to give opening remarks, and then a chance to respond to each other, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. For our audience members, please use the Q&A box. I will read out the questions aloud. If you want to raise your hand and speak, please do so, and just use the raise hand function, and I will unmute you so you can speak. Okay, so the politics of solidarity, Israel, Palestine, and the left. Quote, "The history of thought, to say nothing of political movements, is extravagantly illustrative of how the dictum solidarity before criticism means the end of criticism. I take criticism so seriously as to believe that, even in the very midst of battle, in which one is unmistakably on one side against another, there should be criticism, because there must be critical consciousness if there are to be issues, problems, values, even lives to be fought for." Edward Said in Secular Criticism, 1983. And a second quote, "The Palestinian struggle for justice is especially something with which one must express solidarity rather than endless criticism and exasperated, frustrating discouragement or crippling divisiveness. Remember the solidarity here and everywhere." Edward Said in On Dignity and Solidarity, 2003. Since the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and the New Left anti-Vietnam War movement, one word has characterized the left's relationship to Israel-Palestine more than any other: solidarity. Since then, there have been major changes in political organization and political consciousness, both in the region and beyond. Yet the concept of solidarity has remained. But perhaps this consistency is misleading. This panel asks you to consider, what are the limits of the politics of solidarity? How has it changed historically in relation to changes on the left and changes in the politics of the Palestinians and the Israelis? How do you understand the political question, who is in solidarity with whom? How adequate or inadequate is the politics of solidarity to the current political situation in Israel-Palestine? What can all this tell us about the historical situation of the left today? So with that, we'll turn to our first speaker, Moshé Machover.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'll try to stick to the 10 minutes limit. If there's anything to add, it will come out in discussion. Being quite ancient in age, I can remember the events and the evolution of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle since a long time ago. I arrived in Britain soon after the 1967 war. And at that time, it was still the case that a lot of the left, including what you may call the radical left, was at best ambivalent about the conflict, and parts of that left were actually quite sympathetic to Israel, which was regarded as a kind of socialist paradigm, or parts of it as a socialist paradigm. We worked very hard to educate the left. My comrades and I in Britain, in the United States, in France, in Germany, worked very hard to educate the left on the realities and as it were, the fundamental issues involved in this conflict. We have succeeded to a large extent. You'd be hard put to find any group that you can classify as belonging to the radical left. I'm not talking about the sort of the pink left, but the radical left that is not supportive of Palestinian human and national rights. There are very few exceptions. I mean, you'd be hard put in Britain. I'm aware of one group, that smallish group that describes itself as Trotskyist, which is sympathetic to Zionism, but this is only part of its being what can be described as social imperialists. So, I mean, it's not surprising that they are quite supportive of Zionism. But on the whole, the radical left has stood in solidarity with Palestinian struggle. This did not apply to the liberal or soft left. It hasn't applied to it until quite recently, but I think that similar to the shift, I mean, there have been two shifts that I'm aware of historically. The situation in terms of solidarity has developed gradually, step by step, but there were two periods when there was a sort of stepwise jump, a rather rapid change in consciousness. One is the one I'm referring to, I referred to earlier, in other words, the early 1970s, where the radical left was persuaded, not only by our education, but also by events, to support Palestinian struggle. The other jump occurred quite recently, and that is signaled, or a symptom of it, if you like, are two quite extraordinary statements that appeared by human rights organizations. Now, these do not represent the radical left, and they haven't been embraced only by the radical left. For the radical left, they didn't say anything that he didn't that it hadn't known already. But they were embraced by a lot of soft left and liberals. I'm referring, of course, to the fairly recent statement by B'Tselem, the major Israeli human rights organization, that came out with the definition that, the statement that Israel operates a system of apartheid and Jewish supremacy in the whole of the territory ruled by it. That is to say, not only in the territories occupied in 1967, but in what was Israel before 1967. Soon afterwards, Human Rights Watch, a major United States human rights organization, again, not part of the radical left by any means, as I would define it, I would describe it as a liberal, came out with a fairly similar description of the situation, although it still distinguishes between the regime that Israel operates in the territories occupied in 1967 and the previous the area of Israel before 1967. Both are described in very harsh terms, but the term apartheid is applied to only to the newly occupied, the 67 occupied territories. Not that Human Rights Watch is very complimentary about the rest of the territory. Now, I would say that this is a very welcome development, and we have witnessed a shift in consciousness. Various opinion polls demonstrate a shift in consciousness about an attitude towards the colonial conflict in the Middle East in various Western countries, in some more, some less. The most important, I think, is what is actually happening in the United States. Both because the United States is the major imperialist power and the major backer of the Zionist state of Israel, the settler state of Israel, and but also because in the United States is a very important Jewish community, and attitudes within it have shifted quite visibly, especially among the younger generation, people roughly under 30 years old. I don't need to tell you, those who live in the United States, I'm sure that you have sensed a shift in attitude. Now, this is very welcome, but there is a big but. The description, the labels attached to the Israeli regime by B'Tselem and the Human Rights Watch, and which are bandied about. I mean, you'd find them repeated and quoted endlessly on the left, apartheid and Jewish supremacy. These are descriptive terms. They are not analytic. In other words, they describe a kind of situation. The crime of apartheid is described as a matter of international law. It has been, there is an international law definition of the crime of apartheid. And of course, it applies to the situation, to the regime operated by Israel in the whole of this territory. Jewish supremacy is also a descriptive term. What they denote is systematic and systemic racism. But they don't explain anything. And in order to really target your solidarity with the oppressed in this conflict, you have to understand and not just describe the situation. You have to know apartheid in service of what? Jewish supremacy in service of what? Because apartheid, as I said, is
1 minute, Moshé.
Just another word for systemic racism. But racism serves various purposes in various places. There is racism all over the place. What is it in aid of? And here I come to the need to understand the situation in analytic terms. The first thing to understand in this is that what we are witnessing in the Israel, Palestine, and this has been the case since the beginning of the 20th century, is a colonial conflict. It is a conflict which arises out of the Zionist project, which is a project of colonization, of which the settler state of Israel is both product and an instrument for its further continuation. This is analytic point number one. But if you stop there, you still don't understand the situation sufficiently in order to exercise the right kind of solidarity, because colonization comes in various varieties. And what is important to understand is that the kind of colonization that has been in operation in Palestine is, for example, not the same as the one that operated in South Africa. And here the term apartheid is to some extent an obstruction to understanding, because however much you repeat that the crime of apartheid as defined in international law does not refer only to a form that was applied in South Africa, that it's more general. Nevertheless, when people hear apartheid, they tend to think immediately of South Africa. And this is deceptive, because the colonization of Palestine has belonged to a species of colonization which Marxists distinguish sharply from the one that operated in South Africa. I'm referring to what academic discourse or post-colonial academic discourse defines as secular colonialism. But
Moshé, please try to just wrap it up in the next minute or so.
I need 3 minutes to finalize.
Okay.
Academic discourse does not actually make not always the crucial Marxist distinction, which refers to the mode of production. The mode of production of Zionist colonization was unlike that in South Africa. In the latter, in South Africa, the colonizers, the settlers, depended in their economy on the labor power of the indigenous people. The case of Zionist colonization was more akin to the colonization of the northern part of North America, what became the northern United States, Canada, or Australia. I would say that for Zionism, the Palestinians were the analog of what the famous United States founding document refers to: the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. This is how the indigenous people are referred to in the American Declaration of Independence. They were not used as labor power for the political economy of that colonization. This has momentous critical consequences in terms of the evolution of the colonization and its prospects. I would stop here because I'm running out of time, but we can explore this critical definition and analysis of the foundations of the conflict when we come to elaborate its implications.
Moshé, thank you very much. Next we'll come to Marco.
Yeah, hi, thanks for inviting me and in the wider sense, Angry Workers. We're a small collective trying to support the self-organization of workers in workplaces and beyond. from an internationalist point of view. So I'm a hospital worker, but here today I'm present a few ideas that we expressed in our editorial on the conflict in Israel-Palestine. And we got a lot of criticism because we asked the question, solidarity with who and how. And we basically put forward a fairly, I think, basic position to say, like, to fight the violence of the state of Israel in that region. It's not kind of primarily a question of national liberation. It's still a question of, of a class struggle. And that seemed to be very kind of provocative, and we got a lot of stick for that. But what do we mean by that? I mean, obviously the situation Israel-Palestine is very, let's say, over the years of military tension, occupation, is a very blockaded one. And there is, to a certain degree, what Moshé said, a separation also in terms of labor market. But I wouldn't say it's a complete separation. There were always like an exchange also on workers' terms. Our concern was more that the left at the moment, how they understand the dispute, fails to see what is happening in the wider region. So our hope is that the struggle since the Arab Spring, but particularly since October 2019 in the region, from Lebanon, Tunisia, Iran, Iraq, these struggles had a new quality that went beyond, the normal sectarianism. The Sunni Shia thing was less of an issue. It was less of an appeal to just kind of, the democratic forces. It was more at a class nature, in the sense of that the struggle used kind of, for example, blockades of the bigger refineries in Iran, Iraq, the basically fairly straightforward working class content, and had a kind of quality to it that could recompose working class struggles in the region. And our hope is that will also help to kind of break this blockade of class division in the Palestine-Israel conflict. I think the left, as it is at the moment, is basically bringing old and new baggage to that question, or in their analysis. We either have a very old school kind of anti-imperialist left that is basically saying, okay, US imperialism, Israel is kind of the representative in the region. It's clear we're kind of confronting that on anti-imperialist terms. So, whoever is the force that opposes that, be it Hamas supported by either Iran, Qatar, Turkey, or other forces, that's our natural ally here. So it's an old school anti-imperialist left. And there's a new left that comes out of the more like postmodern, post-colonial, intersectional discourse, who say like, your position is class reductionist. You don't see the special form of oppression as a nationality. It's a discourse of, more like the question of colonialism rather than capitalism. And we think this kind of fusion of an old left that operates in the mode of, anti-imperialist national liberation, with this kind of new postmodern, more kind of identity politic left, leads to a kind of fatal, I would say, blindfolds when it comes to how to express solidarity. So for us, obviously, in a situation that is defined by military conflict, the question is like, how can the working class struggle under these kind of conditions when there's material separation in force and all that? We and some of our comrades dug out some of our own experiences doing moments of that kind. And we published 2 recent articles. One was about this: what kind of solidarity can you express during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa? Were we to suppose the ANC, knowing that the trajectory of the ANC was basically to channel working class struggle into a kind of, democratic capitalist kind of direction? Were there alternatives? How could we, in this kind of moment of, fairly severe divisions, how can we kind of support a working class position in this? And there's a bit, you can look, the article is very kind of gripping from a personal point of view as well. The other situation was in Yugoslavia during the Yugoslav war, where again, like the left took either the side of, and that was in Germany, represented by the Green Party, an anti-fascist point of view that said we have to prevent another Auschwitz in Bosnia. So that's why we have to send, NATO and UN troops to Yugoslavia. Or we had an anti-imperialist left that said, it's Western imperialism attacking Serbia. So, the left had a definite blockade in that situation. And there were a tiny minority of comrades who, organized a workers' aid to Bosniates, what was the name of it? And it was like growing out of the old solidarity between mining communities in England and in Bosnia. So it was an intervention on a class line, and also in practical sense. Maybe to conclude, I mean, for us, the question is really, how can we broaden the view and see a kind of connection between the class movements in the region? General strike recently in Algeria. Do we see tendencies there that can kind of break the deadlock that we face in Israel-Palestine? For that, we would have to put forward something like a concept of universal emancipation of the working class. And I think that is missing. The left is mainly looking into, national liberation. What would that mean? It would mean an escalation of military conflict to a certain degree. If you think what is the theoretical logical consequence, it is more weapons for Hamas, and there the competition of victimhood is kind of a spiral. You've got like some people who support Rojava in Kurdistan and the national liberation there, but they are allies with, the US, and to a certain degree would oppose forces like Hamas and their supporters. So all of a sudden you've got, a clash of interest there. Who's the bigger victim? Finally, also the question of Zionism. I mean, on one hand, you speak in favor of national liberation. How can you make a kind of very clear distinction between national liberation, in the sense of Palestinians, and Zionism as a form of national liberation of the most suppressed Jewish kind of European ethnic community? So in the end, I think it's about the defense of a working class line that shouldn't be abstract, that I think we can develop in concrete terms. Okay, I'll leave it here and then we can go into discussion. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Marco. And next we'll come to Yoav.
Thank you, Ephraim, and thank you for the chance to speak here. My name is Yoav Gal Tamir, and I'm a member of Da'am party. The name Da'am in Arabic means support. So we basically have solidarity, the name of our party. And the reason for this is that the people who founded Da'am party were members or took part in the 80s, in the first Intifada, that brought eventually to the Oslo Accords, and this is when they founded Da'am party. Now, the idea was that in the Oslo Accords, the way that Da'am party saw it was the end of the idea of a Palestinian national state. And I know that what I'm saying here could be a little bit provocative, but this is something that we talk about solidarity, and I want to connect to what Marco said, that asks with whom. Then we are asking, as a political party that is composed of members, of activists that work every day to find the solution for and to bring a solution to the situation that Palestinians live in today, which means that there are 5 million people under Israeli rule that do not have any sort of human or civil rights. And this state of affairs have been going on for 50 years. And the way that we saw it, not me, obviously, but the founders of the party, and the way that we see it now is that the two-state solution was done for with the Oslo Accords and the foundation of the Palestinian Authority. And this is where the Dam Party was founded. And ever since then, we have been engaged in work on the ground, if it's organizing workers, if it's organizing women and women empowerment, all within the Arab population in Israel, because the Oslo Accords, drew lines, of course, not state lines, but drew lines where you have Israel, then you have the Palestinian Authority, where we could not work anymore. And we've been doing this work ever since, somewhat under the radar, because the two-state solution was the solution for the Palestinian and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And this is what the solidarity of the left was aimed at the Palestinian state that we said was could not come to be because of the Oslo Accords and the way that they were written and the way that the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah, basically agreed to, and became, from that moment, became a sort of contractor for the Israeli apartheid regime. And we continue on saying that throughout the years. And the Dam Party was founded in support of the Palestinian people that we saw as the main victims of this agreement, of the Oslo Accords. And this was supported by everyone, including the left in Israel, including the Arab parties, everyone. And then when the disappointment from the Oslo Accords that did not bring to a Palestinian state blew up in the second Intifada in the 2000s. And then Hamas came to power, took over. And everyone kind of ran towards that. We also said that this is not the way. This is not what will bring an end or a solution to the Palestinian people. And we see this the same way today. We try to look at the solution to the conflict in a broader sense, not just in the sense of what Israel is going to do about it, or what the Palestinian Authority or Hamas and showing solidarity with the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people need solidarity because they live in a very, very, very dire situation, of course. But there's also the question of what is the solution? Now, in 2011, we saw that the Arab Spring broke out, and we also saw this as a possible answer to what needs to happen here as well, as part of democratic solution to the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And we supported the Arab Spring. And unfortunately, we saw that in Israel as well, and definitely in Palestine, in the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and in the international left, it wasn't clear that the Arab Spring is democratic or that it's something that needs to be supported. And unfortunately, there were a lot of them from the old traditional left that took on still the point of view of the the anti-imperialist view, and went against the Arab Spring. And also the Palestinian Authority went against the Arab Spring and supported Assad, and still supports Assad, even though he killed Palestinians in Yarmouk. So this kind of cemented also the fact that, first of all, we said that the Palestinians deserve to live under democracy. We also said that that democracy cannot happen with the Palestinian Authority and with Hamas, as the same way that it cannot happen with the right-wing government under Netanyahu until now. And by the way, we are saying today that this government, this new government in Israel, is still not the solution, because it's a mishmash of parties from the Muslim Brotherhood to the right-wing settlers, with Likud in them as well. People who came out of the Likud. This is not a democratic. This is not the democratic solution that we are looking for. To bring the agreement between them was to put the Palestinians aside, the Palestinian question aside again, in order to replace Netanyahu. Most importantly, we see that today in the world, you have an ideological shift that if for the last 40 years, the United States was the pillar of neoliberalism, was the pillar of capitalism ever since Reagan. Now we see that there's a shift not only with the Jewish community as the way it regards Israel, that there is a huge shift, I agree completely. But there's a shift to democracy. There's a shift to promote social justice. We saw it with Black Lives Matter. We saw it with the Sunrise Movement, the global warming, the movement against global warming. And these two main causes, global warming, climate crisis, and democracy, and the fight for democracy, this is now what leads the world. And the question is today, where do we stand? Do we stand with democracy, or do we stand with autocracy? Do we stand with the fight against climate change, or do we stand with oil and science denial and all that with Trump, basically? And that is where we put Israel and the Palestinians as well. The question is whether or not, the question is the fight for democracy. This is what we're doing here. We're fighting for democracy. And we are saying something very simple. Palestinians deserve democracy. And this is why we saw the last war here as, by the way that we saw it was not only us, but the way that it was just a fight between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority that obviously goes through Israel as well. But everybody went with that, everybody went with Hamas. And why? Because the Palestinian Authority canceled the elections. So again, when we talk about solidarity, and we work every day with solidarity with workers, with Palestinian workers that work in Israel and in the settlers. We work with Palestinians that come to Israel and don't have any rights at all. And we hear from the ground, and they'll tell you that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are not the answer. And they have to come to Israel in order to work for reasons that are known to everyone. And we demand that they will have basic human and civilian rights, such as the right to vote. And this is why we call, and now I'll wrap it up. And this is why we call now we dropped the name Down Workers' Party because we now took on something a little broader than that. Okay, and we ran for the last 4 elections in Israel under the with an Israeli-Palestinian Green New Deal that demands wants to build a one democratic state for Israelis and Palestinians. This is the only way that there could be solution here, and we do this because we see that this is the fight that is happening around the world today.
Yoav, thank you very much. And finally, we'll come to Arash Azizi.
Thank you very much. I should say the last time I spoke at a Plativist meeting, it was a long time ago. I don't know how many, like 10 years ago or something, at the University of Toronto about the student movement there. So it's good to be back with you guys. Also, I'll try to speak to the questions that were posed, and then hopefully we can bring up some of the other points in the conversation. So the questions were around the in the spirit of questions, I want, the topic of solidarity is what I'm going to address, which of course, I also speak as a perspective of the left in the region, and particularly Iran, which has a central role in this conflict that is often sort of not talked about, of course. And also the sort of Western left in the United States particularly, and the changes that it has had. So on the question of what are the limits of the politics of solidarity today, my critique of the sort of Western left's position on the conflict and the kind of solidarity that it shows is that it effectively ignores the fact that there are two national groups living in Israel and Palestine, and that there is indeed a conflict. In fact, in a series of totally bizarre propositions that are not dominant on the left, it's almost like a dystopian thing, because they're propositions that clearly have very little to do with truth, and however they're taken as orthodoxies that you cannot challenge. One of them is that there is no conflict. There's no conflict going on there. If you think this is bizarre, you can sort of search for it on Twitter or Google and see how many people use this line. And that effectively, there's a very simple point happening, that this place needs to be a one state for everybody who's currently there, although it's not always clear whether everybody actually is supposed to get inclusion there or not, and that Palestinians are asking for human rights, and that they should be given it, and that there is no conflict. So effectively, as I said, there is the reality, of course, is not that. Whatever one position one wants to have, it is the fact that there are two national groupings living in Palestine and Israel, and that there has indeed been a conflict. Now, the fact that in this conflict, as if we found ourselves in 2021, we have the brutal subjugation and apartheid conditions, which I agree with what apartheid generally being used to for the place, and the brutal subjugation of the Palestinian people, and the brutal occupation that has been going on since 1967. But there clearly is a national conflict. Now, the question of the left, whether in Iran or in the United States, is what you do when there is a national conflict going on. And there, in fact, of course, in my opinion, we should have a position of solidarity with the left in both national communities, basically, and build links to the left in both national communities, and a stand for a position that, on its principles, it stands for the end of the occupation, of course, and equal rights and democratic rights, as the comrade from Dan was saying, to all the peoples living there. Now, the particular form that can take, to a state solution or one state solution, is a secondary question. So there is that. And of course, then there's the question of class struggle. Now, again, the position now on the American left, as written recently in many journals, is that there is basically no left in Israel. You can't really acknowledge a left in Israel. And the working class in Israel, Jewish workers, are not to be considered basically a progressive element of any source. There are articles written about this, in books and in dominant press on the left in the United States, that basically writes off. Apparently, we need to have a new slogan: "The workers of the world unite, except Jewish workers in Israel." So these are problems of the solidarity. The other problem of the solidarity is that, which I think why that solidarity in the criticism question is very apt. We are basically told that you cannot have any criticism, and that you should support. So, for example, if you ask about the BDS movement, that is now sort of very dominantly supported on the American left, and it's an orthodoxy that cannot be questioned. We are told that it should be supported because Palestinian civil society has once called for it in 2005, and sort of that's all you do. You got to support it, and there's nothing else you can do. It's very hypocritical, this one, of course, because then when it comes to the question of what particular solution to support for the conflict, advocating two-state solution today in the American left is, it's tantamount to political suicide. You cannot do anything like that. Whereas none of the major forces in Israel or Palestine advocate a one-state solution. I know that DAM does it since 2018, but as the electoral performance of this comrade shows, it is not a major force in politics of Israel. He has very little support in Israel, where people combo, which is not true of the other major socialist parties in Israel, which get whether the non-Zionist ones or the social Zionist ones, which get significant electoral support. At any rate, which is not to say that that position can't be supported, of course, but it shows the sort of hypocrisy here. Now, so these are some of the problems of the solidarity movement. Now, the question that you posed are many, but I'll try to get sort of to a basic historical perspective here. The politics, of course, on solidarity were always like this. Now, Comrade Machover, who has lived much of this history, spoke about sort of the pro-Zionism that existed back in the day. But it's also the fact that the Communist Party and the Communist movement, which gets a lot of sort of beating, of course, now there is, for example, even the Communist Party's position in 1948, basically support for the Christian state of Israel, is heavily criticized now, by all sorts of people. It should be remembered, by the way, that it certainly wasn't a diktat from Moscow, and it was also a position taken by the Communist parties in the Arab world, in Iran, in the West. So it wasn't, it wasn't just a sort of usually it's really given as if a Gromyko goes and gives a speech and so the Communist parties follow. There's the historical work shows that this is really not what happened, and that this was a position, right or wrong, taken by the Communist parties themselves. And there were a lot of wrong things about this position, ignoring the Nakba, ignoring the crimes of Israel in 1948, and ignoring some of the fundamental problems that Zionism posed. But it is a fact that this change in the dominant leftist position on Israel-Palestine happened in the 1960s, where the position of the Communist Party, which had always advocated Arab-Jewish solidarity, and it advocates it today in the forms of Hadash and the Communist Party of Israel, which is the main force to the left in the country, this force was rejected in favor of an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist line, which basically had a program it had a one-state program of sorts. It should be clear that this one-state program went with support for PLO, let's be very clear about the difference that the PLO and ANC had. ANC's Freedom Charter started with the line that South Africa belongs to all people who live there, white or black. With this exact wording. The PLO's covenant, on the other hand, made it very clear that none of the Jewish people living there belonged to this place and had any right to be there, except for those who had been there presumably previous to 1917, which was a sort of rhetorical point because they would be a very small group. So the PLO had a position that not only the Jewish people there didn't deserve national rights, not only they didn't deserve to have a Jewish state, but they didn't in fact have a right to be there. So this led to this position obviously had made it a very different sort of solidarity that was expected. This struggle was expected to be shown a very different sort of solidarity when it advocated for this position. Now I'm at the end of my time. So I wonder, looking at this, what I can sort of end with. I think the problem of the inadequacy of the solidarity problem, you asked me what the question is, why is the solidarity inadequate? And perhaps a very quick line about what it could be. The problem with the inadequacy is that it's basically irrelevant. The solidarity movement is mostly irrelevant to changing actual lives in Palestine and Israel. It's irrelevant whether, it's too rich to ask whether we're talking about class struggle or national struggle or what solution. It is effectively a way of attempting a meaning finding for people in the solidarity movement. This has been always a problem, of course, and if we had a history of solidarity movements from, let's say, in West Germany to, about Vietnam, Iran, and Africa in the 1960s, solidarity was being shown in leftist movement in Iran, Africa, and Vietnam, to the Bolivarian movement and all that. It's unfortunately, it is what transpires today in the Western left is that the politics of solidarity there are primarily about the Western leftists. They're not about affecting politics in Israel and Palestine, which is why there's very little active solidarity with the actual political parties there, either in Palestine or Israel. And even when they're sort of following the lead of the Palestinian civil society around the BDS, that still leads to very sort of little change. And I mean, the BDS is a different topic that one could think about. So it is about, as I said, meaning making, about sort of making an identity of this issue, of this struggle, which is always, I think, a death of a solidarity movement. And even it's no longer about contributing to real life struggle, but to basically fetishizing, a certain name and a certain place, which without links to the actual movements, and sort of holding it up. And that's precisely what we see in the movement there. What we should have instead, and I'll end it here, what we should have instead is active links to the left in Palestine and Israel, and acknowledging, as opposed to boycotting. You cannot, of course, build links with the left institutions in place if your main program is to boycott all of them and, boycott all universities, boycott all plays, boycott everything about them. You could have targeted boycott, of course, it's a different issue. Acknowledging this, building left links with the left in both national spaces, Palestinians and Israelis, is acknowledging that there are two national communities living there. A fact that was the cornerstone of Edward Said's approach. It was the cornerstone of Mahmoud Said's approach. It was the cornerstone of Communist Party's approach. And seriously, I will end right here. And of course, look, the comrades in Dam can have a great position, one state, to bring all this to great, fantastic. The Trotskyist group that I was a part of had even better solution. Middle East Socialist Federation, get rid of all the states. It's great, bring it on. But there's a real struggle going on. We can also have this position for a socialist federation in North America. I have a number of plans. I'm in Dubai right now. It'd be great. Perhaps we can have different sort of socialist federations in the Middle East. But look, there is the particular existing problem is the occupation, that the fact that Palestinians are just about the only people in the world who have to live under military occupation. And this is what needs to be struggled upon. If the forces on the ground show the capacity for supporting a one-state solution, a republic, a commonwealth there, we should be the first one to support it. Of course, they don't. So
Arash, I'm going to cut you off there.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Okay, we'll now come to a couple of minutes each to respond, and I'll be slightly stricter on the time so we can get to some questions in good order. So Moshé first, please. You should unmute, Moshé, and any comments you have to your fellow panelists.
I refuse to accept this restriction of 2 minutes, just as I reject the two-state solution. There's a lot to respond to, and I have to leave soon, so I will beg to be allowed to respond in some detail to the things that have been said before. I want to start with Marco's very apt observation that we should not look at this conflict, and it is a conflict, in the box of Israel-Palestine, that it is a regional conflict. It started as a regional conflict, and it can only be resolved regionally. And I'll come back to it, why, as distinct from South Africa, it can only be resolved regionally. Yoav said very aptly that the two-state solution is to be rejected. Matzpen, from which down is a split of a split of a split, said so from the very beginning. We pointed out that this two-state solution is an illusion and a deception so long as the Zionist regime exists, and so long as we have really two nations, but one is a settler nation oppressing the other, any kind of two-state solution is an illusion, and it is a device for perpetuating the oppression of the oppressed people by the oppressing people. So there are two nations indeed, but they are to put the picture in a symmetric form is a deception, and a wicked deception, a dangerous deception. And similarly, the idea, don't tell me why the communist parties changed their position. You were not born then, but I remember it. And I remember that it was precisely because of Moscow dictate. It happened in one day. In one day, as previously, and this I don't remember, but you know, and I know from books, that the Stalin-Hitler pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, immediately changed the position of the communist parties all around the world from opposition to Germany to supporting this evil and delusionary. Both steps by Stalin were a delusion, actually big mistakes by himself. The biggest mistake was the pact with Hitler, which he believed in and didn't believe all the warnings that Germany was going to attack, and paid, the Soviet people paid heavily for this. And the other was a delusion that by supporting the partition of Palestine, he's going to get rid of British imperialism. He got rid of British imperialism, but introduced American imperialism, much more powerful. So don't tell me these stories. These are inventions. Now, the point to understand why the regional context is so important, and here I must criticize Yoav's position. In the case of Israel-Palestine, a bourgeois democratic solution is not possible. It was possible in South Africa because the major force that was pushing for it, basically the black working class, the majority of the working class, had something to gain from a bourgeois democratic revolution. It didn't gain socialism, it was betrayed, and the agreement reached between Mandela and de Klerk did not deliver social liberation, but it improved the position of the black working class no end. It had something to gain. The difference with Palestine is that in order to get any decent, any equitable solution of the conflict there, the Zionist regime has to be overthrown. And the question is, what force is capable of overthrowing the Zionist regime? In South Africa, we had an internal force, a huge black working class. In the case of Israel-Palestine, there is no such force that is liable to gain from a bourgeois democratic revolution. You have to, it is an illusion that the Israeli working class the vast majority of it is Jewish working class, or so-called Jewish, I call it a Hebrew working class, has nothing to gain from a bourgeois democratic revolution. It is already living in a bourgeois so-called democracy. A purely bourgeois democratic revolution will mean that this working class will exchange its position from an exploiting class with national privileges to an exploiting class without national privileges. The Jewish working class has very little to gain from a purely bourgeois democratic revolution. This is why we have always said, and we persisted, and I think we were right is saying it in 1966 already, that a proper solution to the conflict that arose from Zionist colonization is regional and is socialist. It is within a socialist federation of the Middle East. And don't laugh at it. There are problems in this world, not least the most important problem of climate and ecology, that can only be solved by socialism, that cannot be solved within the capitalist context. So if you believe in socialism, then there is a reason why you believe in socialism, because socialism is necessary in order to solve certain problems. And one of these problems, unfortunately, is the problem we are facing in Israel and Palestine that cannot be solved by a purely bourgeois democratic revolution. A regional socialist revolution, and it has to be regional, because socialism in one country is a joke. It has to be regional. Would mean if the Israeli Jewish working class was invited on the basis of class solidarity to participate in it, would mean that the Israeli Hebrew working class would exchange its position of an exploited class, with national privileges to part of a ruling dominant class without national privileges. This is a deal that makes sense. It could make sense. Of course, it will not happen just out of the air. It needs preparation, organizational and otherwise, and ideological. But this is the only possible solution. A bourgeois democratic solution to this conflict is not possible. It is an illusion. What is possible, of course, two-state solution is nonsense and an evil nonsense, because it actually plays into the hands of the oppressor. But raising democratic demands as Daam does, I'm not against it. I think it's doing a lot of good, but don't fall into the illusion that these demands can be satisfied within a purely democratic revolution. A democratic change, purely democratic change, and purely in the box of Israel-Palestine is not possible, regrettably. But this is the situation, not for general reasons. In some countries it was possible, in South Africa it was possible, but the political economy is completely different, and therefore it doesn't allow for this possibility. So by all means, raise democratic demands. You're doing a very good job. At least you are embarrassing the oppressor. This is very good. Why do you object to democratic rights for all? Why do you object for equal rights? Yes, I mean, these are very good demands, but don't expect that you can actually satisfy them within a purely bourgeois democratic framework. What I think solidarity should be directed to is the real possibility of the Zionist regime perpetrating something that the South African oppressors were never able to do. They were not able to perpetrate ethnic cleansing because they needed the black working class as a source of labor power for their political economy. For the case of the Israeli Zionist oppressors, the Palestinians are surplus to requirements for the most part. They don't need them, and they would be happy to ethnically cleanse them. And beware that this danger of ethnic cleansing is being planned, and they are only waiting for the opportune moment, what is in Hebrew called sha'at hakosher, the opportune moment to perpetrate a huge ethnic cleansing on the scale of the Nakba of 1947-49.
Okay, thanks, Moshé. Marco.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I guess if you want to think about how to, you know, split, let's say, the working class in Israel from the ruling class regime, we have to develop a different, let's say, perspective and hope of emancipation. I mean, it will be, let's say, from the outside and a kind of a wider class force in the region that can actually develop something like, you know, what is life beyond, you know, being a waged worker in a regime that, you know, also puts a lot of fear probably on you know, workers in Israel itself. It's like a privileged prison kind of position. So what could be this kind of emancipation? I think with the left that still thinks like, you know, 79 revolution Iran was something to support because it was, you know, anti-imperialist. That type of emancipation will, you know, definitely not cause any kind of split of the working class with their, you know, with the ruling regime. The other question is, will the promise of democracy kind of help us much? I mean, if we look at democratic states like India, biggest democracy of the world, obviously you can't say it's not a settler colonial state, but there's a lot of, let's say, internal displacements. I mean, the amount of, you know, slum demolition, it doesn't happen to kind of an occupied different nationality. It happens against your own working class. I mean, on a scale that is probably, you know, much bigger than in Palestine. I mean, people are, if you're from a small village, you come to the town, you don't have much democratic rights. You're a migrant worker who's kind of, yeah, basically, you know, at the whim of bosses in the state. So same with, you know, a situation like Brazil or Mexico, where we've got mass murder in occupied territory if you live in a poor area of, you know, private paramilitary forces or of state forces. So the question is like, democracy, is that enough of an understanding of what liberation could mean for, you know, for workers in the region? And I think there we have to take the lead of the movements that are there, which I think go beyond just, you know, just the claim of democracy of the Arab Spring. They really put forward social demands. They really say like, you know, we can't live on these wages. We can't deal with these power cuts. You know, this won't be changed by just having this leader or that leader. It's something has to change in the class forces here. We have to unite more on a class basis and not just like, you know, on a political basis of supporting this or that, you know, new political force like party-wise. So I think we can take the lead, you know, from a lot of movements in the region. The question is like, what kind of left is there that really kind of translates that into, you know, a language of emancipation and some kind of very clear practical bridges. So not just like a support with the left. I think, you know, obviously it's good if we have left organization and groups in both, you know, parts, Israel and Palestine, but there has to be really a practical solidarity with workers on the ground, which is very difficult, you know, to establish. I give one example. Logistics workers in Italy, they had the biggest wage struggles, and they're all migrant workers in 2011. They did that against a situation where their permission to stay in Italy was tied to their job. It was like, you can say, a certain type of apartheid system, in the sense like, if you don't stick to your job, you will be deported. They gathered the courage to you know, organize in the thousands in these kind of warehouses, influenced by the Arab Spring. They said, if at home, because most of them were from Northern Africa, like Maghrebian population, if they can take on Mubarak's police state, we can take on IKEA or FedEx or TNT. So there was something that, you know, an internationalism that was not like an internationalism of the slogans or programs. It was an internationalism that, you know, where workers in different situations take courage from international movements. And the left is often too, you know, distant from these kind of trends within the class. So, yeah.
Thanks, Marco. Yoav.
All right, I'll be very brief. I just wanted to say that, okay, Moshe knows us well, and where we differ is that we see it the other way around. The only way to change the Israeli Zionist regime is through a democratic movement here, a Palestinian democrat, and obviously also an Israeli democratic movement. And this is not something theoretical that we're saying what kind of regime would benefit the working class. No, this is something that's been happening in the entire region since 2011, and you could say even earlier, from 2006, 2008. And Arab peoples stood up and demanded democracy. So I don't think we can do anything else. And unfortunately, a lot of the traditional left did not support it, but we couldn't do anything less but support it. And we also support it here. And we support everyone here, Palestinian and Israeli, who supports it. And there are people who support it, there are forces who support it. And this demand for democracy from Tunis to Iran also reached the United States. So that's why I'm saying that in this world that we're living today, after the Arab Spring, and now with the Biden regime in the Biden administration in the United States, if and when such a movement also begins here in Israel and Palestine, it will have to go through first, unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, who are not democratic, forces. And then it'll be able to take on the Zionist regime. And I'll tell you what, it'll have a better time with the Zionist regime than it would have with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And when this happens, this is what's going to change Israel. Nothing from outside. And then when this happens, there will be a lot of place, and there's going to be a lot of meaning for any solidarity that unfortunately goes to waste today, because after the end of the two-state solution, there is no prospect and no kind of horizon for basically any kind of solution here. So it kind of goes to waste. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoav. And Arash.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. Thank you for all the comments, for the points. I do hope, as a historian of the movement, it gives me a joy to talk to Comrade Machover about 1948, but hopefully we can one day look at some of the documents and see the parties in the region did not act on the basis of Moscow's diktats. They liked Moscow's position. They discussed it, and they said in their meetings that they liked this position and that they're supporting it. They did not. No one told them. Moscow, in fact, didn't really care about the Arab Communist parties enough to try to put a diktat. But I'm sure you can tell us what the communist movement in Palestine and what it was. But on the question of democracy and socialism, and the age-old question of basically stages, democratic socialism, I'll just add this. And look, one of the big problems here is, one of the big basic questions is, what is the problem in Israel and Palestine, right? In politics, the question is, what is the problem? And this is where the differences are. For the dominant line currently in the American left, the problem is that Israel exists as a Jewish state and as a settler colonial state. And the problem is that the Zionist movement and its history, but it's not clear what it means when the problem is what happened 100 years ago, and throughout this 100 years ago, is not clear what it means. It's not clear what it means, that what's the problem now? Is it like the nature of the state? Is it the fact that it uses this word Jewish states? And we can get to this sort of conversations of Zionism. It's not always clear, what the particular problem is. For me, the first existing important problem, there are two problems. Yes, the nature of the Israeli state and the way that it is a Jewish state, and its relationship to its populace, and particularly to its Palestinian citizens, it is indeed a big problem. The much bigger problem is the occupation. The fact that millions of Palestinians or stateless and live under military occupation. Funnily enough, in the dominant again politics of the American left, the distinction between this is taken away, basically, that it doesn't matter whether you're which side of the green line, that you're oppressed. Of course, you're oppressed, but a very different kind of oppressed. So for me, the question, it's a basic democratic problem, that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And this is forgotten. Nowhere else in the world, you have an entire people, millions of people who are stateless and live under a military occupation of another state. This is very different from, say, the Uyghurs in China, very different from different populations in India, some of whom are, in fact, by the way, national minorities that are oppressed by the democratic Indian state. The question of Kashmir, of course, is an obvious one, not to mention other sort of indigenous people in seven sister states in India. But that is the particular problem, and it requires a democratic solution. Now, to have this sort of old Trotskyist line that some democratic solutions can't be solved within capitalism, so we need a sort of a gigantic multinational socialist revolution. It's a position on a very flimsy basis, frankly. It's a position on the basis of a few Marxist phrasings. That is also it's a very fun thing to say to someone living, under occupation in Nablus, that the only way you can have statehood and basic rights that the rest of us in this panel now have is if you have a multinational socialist revolution that changes the entire configuration of the region. Thankfully, for the reality, from a realistic perspective, materialist perspective, it is not true that you indeed need a socialist revolution, and that it is absolutely possible to have two states which give basic citizenship rights to people. And the last line I would say is that this whole, a very advanced system of sophistry exists to prove that two-state solution is somehow impossible. Then it was always impossible. It could have never happened in the capitalist spaces. The Israelis would never allow that. It's absolutely, and I apologize to use this, it's absolutely nonsense. It could have entirely happened in 2000 if a couple of talks in Camp David had gone a different way. And I'm happy to sort of discuss the details if it ever comes up. But I hope it's clear what I said. Okay.
Thanks, Arash. Just before Moshé has to leave, I want to make sure we get a chance to come to a question that's directed at him. And we have one already in the Q&A box. Just to our audience, if you do have questions, please type them in the Q&A box and I'll try to get to them. It does seem, Moshé, that one of the main distinctions between you and the other panelists is about this question of essentially organizing a joint Jewish-Arab working class in Israel, and what the meaning of that is politically. And I think you kind of addressed this in the way that you differentiated between what you called the political economy of South Africa as compared to Israel-Palestine. So there's a question from Mike in the chat, which I'm just going to read out, that I think touches on this. He says, Moshé, I don't think the distinction of the mode of production is very helpful here and may even be misleading. Insofar as capitalism is a global totality and apparently atavistic reliance on indigenous labor in whatever form, even if it's not identifiable as wage labor, is produced from out of this global mode of production in the various manifestations of its contradictions, is it not? Do you not think one has to understand both South African apartheid and the conflict in Israel-Palestine in the context of global capital and how global capital produces such conflicts? It seems to me that one must draw out what unites these conflicts and that this is something post-colonial discourse tends to elide.
No, I reject this attempt to dissolve the local in the global. Of course, we are living in a global world, but and this is expressed, of course, in the fact that the Israeli capital employs a lot of Chinese workers in conditions of near slavery, in large-scale construction, Romanian and Polish workers in small-scale building, Thai workers in agriculture and so on. But this is of limited scope. The bulk of the working force exploited and employed by Israeli capital in Israel are Israeli Jewish workers. There is also an important but minority of Palestinian Arab workers. Now, is class solidarity possible between Hebrew workers and Palestinian Arab workers within Israel? I think the experience of Dam shows that it is possible. It is possible, and this is not only this small political group that shows it. A much more important illustration of this is the very successful, relatively new trade union organization called Koach La'oved, Power to the Workers, which organizes on an equal basis, on an internationalist basis, workers of both national groups. On the level of class struggle, on the level of trade union struggle, there is not only possible, but there is actual solidarity among workers of both nationalities, the oppressor nationality and the oppressed nationality. This was actually demonstrated in reality during the events following the onslaught of Israel against Gaza, when there were certain riots, mainly of Jewish secular fundamentalists against Palestinian Arabs. The workers organized in Koach La'oved actually displayed self-endangering solidarity on the part of Jewish Hebrew workers to defend and to protect their Arab colleagues. There were instances that I know of in detail which such solidarity exists. This is an important kernel to build upon. As Marx said in his time, the experience of workers in trade unions is a school for learning larger aspects of the class struggle. But unfortunately, at the moment, this experience doesn't go beyond the trade union and class, economic class interest struggle. Whether anything beyond this is possible, of course it is, and don't try to belittle the prospect. Yes, you know, you can talk about socialism. You try to solve the problems of the world, including the most important problem of ecology and climate within capitalism. And then you can say, yeah, well, how can we wait for socialism? What are you a socialist for, if not for solving the most important problems of the world? One of these problems, unfortunately, that has to wait, as it were, for socialism is the problem of the oppression of the Palestinian people. I'm sorry that I have to leave you now because I'm required at another meeting. It has been very instructive for me and a big pleasure, and I hope we can repeat this useful discussion some other time.
Moshé, thank you very much for joining us. And
thank you so much.
we hope to host you again soon.
It was an honor. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Moshé. Right, so we've got just over 35 minutes for discussion with the rest of our panelists. There's lots of questions coming in. I'm now going to unmute Richard Rubin to ask a question.
Hi, I'm sorry that Moshé left because with some of the questions I really wanted to ask him. So I guess the fundamental question, I mean, I had one question which was about it seems to me that contrary to what Moshé said, that unlike other colonial settler states, that the motive for Zionism as a colonial settler movement was ideological. And it was related specifically to the idea of Jewish national self-determination and the quote, the Jewish problem. So I wanted to have a kind of broader discussion of the way in which Zionism seems both to have caused the Jewish question to persist, but also transformed it. And I guess since all of you on the panel acknowledge the existence of two national groups, what Moshé called the Hebrew working class, or the Hebrews and the Arabs, I guess the question would be how one can conceive of an anti-Zionist struggle that acknowledges that the Hebrews, the Israeli Jews, have some national or collective rights, right? Not presumably just democratic rights, but also a national collective rights, which seems to have been a fundamental question for the Palestinian national struggle. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Can I say briefly?
Yes.
So,
by the way, I agree with. By the way, I think that like saying that there's just a comment that like saying people in the communist parties were pleased with what Stalin said in 1948. I think that that's rather naive. In 1948, any Stalinist would have been pleased by whatever Stalin said. But so I agreed with
they weren't
Moshé.
Stalinists. They weren't Stalinists. They were members of mass communist party. They had fought their lives for socialism. And anyways, they had a understanding with Stalin. Also, we can think they were idiots, but the point is Moscow didn't tell the parties to change their lines. It's a question of historical fact. We can talk about whether they were wrong or right. But
or maybe the question is whether there was any alternative to partition in 1948. That seems a stronger argument to me.
Also a good question and a funny question, because that's exactly, it's a good point, because you could have argued for it before UN did it, but after UN did it, what were you supposed to have done, really? Anyways, and then there were these discussions between Iraqi and Iranian communist parties, by the way, on this question. No, but on the question of number one, it should be clear that it is not enough to acknowledge a Hebrew, basically Hebrew speaking or the sort of Hebrew national grouping, because number one, they don't consider themselves as such. We can't just national groupings. We can't just make up national groupings as we go and as we sort of like them to be. The working national grouping, national community in Israel Palestine consider themselves a Jewish national consciousness, and also they believe that they have founded a state, not just for Jews who live there, but for Jews from all over the world. An idea that, of course, was also supported in the Soviet Union in the founding of Biro Beit Jan, and of course, it has commonalities to other national communities around the world, and national states found around the world. So that's part of the question. Again, this is not such a radical question. Edward Said, for example, famously said that the Palestinian right of return needed to be reconciled with the Jewish right of return in the kind of solution that he had, which was actually a two-state and then one state. This was the position of Edward Said, basically two states that could confederate one day and get to a one-state solution. So for me, it's very clear, and as a fundamental principle, that the realities of Zionism, whether we like it or not, is foundation of a Jewish national space. Now it can be part of a one-state or two-state that gives refuge to Jews around the world on its basis, just like other national states. If you're a Bulgarian from anywhere, you can migrate to Bulgaria. If you're Italian, you can migrate to Italy. In this case, there is quite clearly, it's not that crazy of an idea that perhaps Jews need a state of their own somewhere, and that they should be able to migrate to at any time. So a Jewish national home, as it were. But of course, it is very important to not forget that symmetry, as Moshé also brought up. It's obscene for us to pretend there is any sort of symmetry there, because the reality is that there is a Jewish state and there is a Jewish protection, but the Palestinians they do not have a national state, and in fact have to live again under a brutal occupation, and as citizens of Israel, they have to experience second-class citizenship. So we start with reality, and this is the reality that we'll try to solve, basically, and fight against. And as I said, we discussed different solutions to it, but this is a recognition, diagnosis of the actually existing problems. Unfortunately, there's the strange irony here is that in the fight against this, then the solutions offered again by the dominant, in the dominant Palestinian national movement and dominant in the Solidarity movement, goes on to affect and negate all rights of Jewish citizens and until 1996, when the PLO changed its covenant, they even denied, as I said, basic rights of existence there. But even now, they deny all national and collective rights. It is bad politics, apart from anything else, i.e., it is an ultra-left position that will never be accepted by the Palestinian, by the Jewish citizens of Israel, that they should give up all their national rights and join a sort of a collective one state. It is an ultra-left position in this sense, although if there was ever any support for it, we should be the first to support it in other countries.
Thanks, Arash. Yoav and Marco, do you want to respond to that question at all?
Yeah, can do. I mean, the question is like national rights, and it's kind of all said like this is basically something that is, you know, of liberating kind of capacity for the working class. I mean, on one hand, we can see like at what point did the working class all of a sudden have fatherlands? Obviously, that's something to do with, you know, welfare rights, you know, something that came, you know, in Europe, let's say Germany, for example, in the 1870s and all that. But it came with the socialist laws. So on one hand, you say like, oh, as a worker, all of a sudden I'm part of this kind of national community, and you get citizenship rights, voting rights, you might get like the welfare. But it came with the absolute oppression of socialist organizations, with the undermining of workers' associations. It was like appropriated by the national state, or the insurance schemes and so on. So it came with the disempowerment of workers, and it ended up, you know, with the parties of the working class, the, you know, Social Democratic Party, the avant-garde of the working class supporting the nation state, leading to, you know, German workers fighting French workers in the trenches. So at that point, you know, the left, and later on, you know, with the so-called foreign policy of the Soviet Union, you know, you give, you know, nation rights and all that, left more and more withdrew from an internationalist point of view, which then also meant that, you know, Zionism, which, you know, maybe initially had a much more kind of a socialist connotation, also became much more focused on we need our nation state in order to guarantee our existence. And even the working class elements within a very class stratified community could say we need be part of a national community. So if we don't break that vicious circle, you know, you end up basically perpetuating a system of, identification with nation states, with massacre. That is not just ideological. If you look at the region, most workers are, you know, in some form of migrants. I mean, if you look at Saudi Arabia, I mean, you've got all migrant workers from all over the world. In Israel itself, you know, the oil workers, I mean, most of them are migrants within that region and fight on that kind of base of experience. So we should relate to that and say, like, it's not a question, you know, does the state kind of accept us as citizens? It's more like, what is our class position vis-a-vis that state? Do we allow the state to, you know, stop us from going from place A to B? But that can happen in India as well. During the pandemic, the state just stopped the trains. You couldn't go back into your own village. So there is something that, you know, I think we have to, you know, redefine internationalism on a practical level.
Thanks, Marco. Yoav, did you want to add something there?
Just 2 points. Regarding the working class, as part of a global solidarity and the question of socialism, we are now not in the same world that we were in the first or the second industrial revolution. And today, the world and profit and it is manufactured not by people, workers, the way it was done back then, but by information and by computers and by automation and AI. And you see that even oil today is not the main source of revenue, but information. And this is why to call it social, you can call it socialism, but we are going into a completely different economy, world economy. And this is why the struggle for freedom and the struggle for rights is not coming from the working class. The working class today is unfortunately conservative and right wing. We saw it with Trump in the United States. We saw it with Brexit in England, and unfortunately in Israel as well. Moshé talked about Koach Ovdim, but the Israeli working class is with the Likud party at most, okay? And the Palestinian working class is also very traditional and very Muslim. The fight for workers' rights today is for human rights. And this is a very big fight that is happening today because we are transitioning into an economy with no work, with no wage labor. So you have to fight for the well-being of workers, because if you don't, you will descend into fascism and into autocracy, as we saw with Trump and everywhere else. That's one point. So I'm saying that the union, the class struggle today, the workers' struggle today is for human rights. Now, when it comes to Israel, I don't think that anyone here has to lose anything, or that anyone here will lose anything if Palestinians will get equal rights as Israelis. On the contrary, if Palestinians here get equal rights as Israelis, Israel or Palestine or whatever you call it, but if everyone will have here equal rights, it will be able to move on, and it will be able to even be better. And by the way, this is not me down without the small thought that I am saying this. This is high-ranking people everywhere in Israel say this all the time. It just doesn't have the political support as of yet, because there's a lot of fear, because there's a lot of mistrust between the two forces, of course. But as we saw in Europe and as we saw in everywhere else, it is possible, and it's the only way to move forward. There's no question here that democracy and equal rights for everyone from the river to the sea, as part of it has to be, of course, as part of a bigger movement, is the only way that we can move forward and not backwards. Everything else will be backwards.
Thanks, Yoav. I'm now going to bring in Kit. Kit, you can ask your question.
Okay, can people hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good, I'm unmuted. Thank you. I wanted to say a couple of things about democracy and nation states and whose class interest various movements serve, because I think we do have to untangle class interest from all the other forms which float around, which the ruling class may play with. I want to get back to that, but I do have to say something about Yoav's last comment and Dam's approach, because I think for many decades, bold new thinkers have been writing off the working class as being the only class which is capable of creating a new society. Going back to Mark Hughes, 60 years ago, there was this talk that the class had ceased to exist, that we were no longer the revolutionary agents, that somehow new forces were appearing. And I'm afraid the argument you just put forward, Yoav, is very much old wine in new bottles. If the working class has lost our ability to be the agent of social change, then yeah, humanity is probably doomed. Then the slide to barbarism will continue, because when you put forward a democratic strategy, which I think Arash also quite likes democratic stages and sees this as being valid in at least part of the world. I think what you are blithely ignoring is that actually democracy in many parts of the world for a heck of a long time has been the preferred form of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. they're quite happy with democracy in many parts of the world, and have been for a long time. Democracy doesn't alter class relationships. It doesn't alter forms of alienation and exploitation. It doesn't alter the conditions that our class lives under. And I think we do have to get back that the bourgeoisie is already dominating the whole planet, dominating the whole globe. Global economy has existed for 100 years, it's nothing new. And the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, are quite happy creating new states, allowing those states to disappear. If you look at the United Nations, the vast majority of the states there have actually been created in the last 100 years, and none of that state creation has assisted the working class in freeing ourselves. Instead, we do have to see that what solidarity is about solidarity within the international working class. That we
Thanks, Kit. I just want to have a chance to bring the panelists back in, so I'm gonna cut you off there if that's okay. Marco, I think this kind of speaks, what Kit's saying speaks to, you know, the position you were trying to present on the panel. I wonder if you wanted to respond.
Yeah, the question is obviously why does that seem so difficult nowadays? I mean, what are the actual, let's say, barriers to working class solidarity? If we think, and there I disagree a bit with what Yoav said, if we have like global supply chains nowadays, if, for example, like a car is now manufactured in 40 different countries, like if you've got more and more workers having the experience of crossing, you know, national borders, you know, we've got a working class that is, you know, on one hand, so global in terms of, you know, access to the internet in most places, not everywhere, being multilingual, probably working for one of the global corporations in one form or the other. So the first time, you know, when Marx was talking about working class or workers of the world unite, he was talking of an absolute minority, you know, of wage laborers, like in more or less the Western world. Now, finally, we've got a global working class, but at the same time, it seems so kind of universal that it seems difficult to find a force within that can overcome, you know, the various lines of division. And there, I think the left is still grappling. I mean, still grappling with understanding what is that kind of global class that is forming. You know, with manufacturing, you know, in China, but it's not like that. There's no manufacturing in the US. But what are the links nowadays? Again, largely an empirical question, really, but also like trying to re-understand certain concept, like, you know, from uneven development, combined development to class composition. These are kind of, let's say, the main categories that the revolutionary left developed from the 20s to 60s, but, you know, we have to probably develop some new ones as well.
I want to kind of, maybe if I can, turn the conversation back towards this issue of what we see in the kind of contemporary left response to Israel-Palestine, because I think what this discussion is getting into is a question of, you know, what the nature of potentially organizing workers in the Middle East and beyond is. But I wanted to get back actually to the shifts that Moshé talked about and that seemed to bring up some kind of division on the panel. The first was the shift that he described around 1967, where the left shifted from a traditional position of Arab-Jewish solidarity that had become embodied in the Communist Party to a kind of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggle that became, I guess, funneled into the PLO as the organization for that. And so the meaning of solidarity then had a shift. And it seems like we are now a long way beyond the end of that period. And there's been a kind of new period that's perhaps even more desperate and more dark in some ways, in which it seems like Hamas is the only kind of, Hamas is the organization that seems to be attacking Israel. And so there can be, the invocation to a united Palestinian people and to have solidarity with them becomes channeled behind that. Moshé then also talked about another shift that's happened recently, which he seems to think is positive. He seemed to think that the first shift is positive, right, in the early 70s, where people shifted towards this anti-imperialist line. And again, he now thinks there's been another positive shift where there's been a change on the left towards supporting the idea that Israel is running a system of apartheid. And I wonder what you guys think about the recent shift on the left. Is this something positive? How do you understand where we are today in terms of the left and its kind of solidarity with Palestine, the solidarity movement? Arash, if you're back, and you can hear us, do you want to take that one first? Okay, we might have some problem getting through to Arash at the moment, but Yoav or Marco, do you want to have a go?
I'll say that first. I want to go with Arash's point that something that obviously we as a political party in Israel call for as well, and that's a cooperation of left in the world with any democratic force in Israel or Palestine. That's the only way, and to try and promote those forces. And that's basically the only way to move forward, just to boycott everything, because it's Israeli is counterproductive, puts all the Israelis in the same box, and basically prevents any movement forward. And you can see, I think that you can see that today, the way that Israel is conceived in the Israeli government, and obviously the apartheid and the occupation is conceived in the world, is it stops being legitimate. It stopped being legitimate, and even by its most historical supporter, the United States. We're not saying that they stopped supporting Israel, but obviously it does not support Israel as much as it did, and today it has a very hard time supporting that kind of regime. But again, I would say that the question is, what's going to happen when there will be a democratic movement in Palestine against the occupation? Will this get the solidarity of the international left? And this is something that, well, I hope that will happen, but as we saw in the Arab Spring, won't necessarily happen because of questions about the nature of democracy and bourgeois democracy and all that kind of the same way that they reacted to what happened in Syria, to the Arab Spring in Syria, and that it's complicated and what that led to. So that will be a challenge. That will be a question that I, for one, hope to, the way that I see things going now, that I hope that it will have the support that it needs in order to bring change.
So you see that as a kind of positive development in the contemporary left?
Definitely, yes.
Marco, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't see the two shifts that particularly positive. I mean, on one hand, you can say it was the same left that, might have shifted to anti-imperialism that, as we said before, was supporting the revolution in Iran, so-called Revolution 79, and thought, oh, that's, something positive. It turned out like a really bad massacre for the working class and whatever communists and socialists in that country. you could say the same about, uncritical support for the Viet Cong at the time. I mean, it's just like, I would think a left that is mainly looking on the national state level has little to offer there. Same during the onset of the uprising in Syria. I think the left was rather absent, not trying to really kind of get to grips what was happening, and got only like really engaged once it turned into, a proxy war, civil war type of situation. So I think theoretically the left is not too well equipped. And if you look at the US, for example, I mean, Black Lives Matters and so on, I think a left that sees, the industrial prison complex or police violence mainly as a continuation from, let's say, the slavery or a settler colonialism, and doesn't see it as part of, a modern capitalist state, is basically lost and disarmed. It will not be able to, let's say, generalize this dispute, but rather help to contain it in terms of in racial terms. Although I would think, there's a class element. I'm not saying there's no hierarchy in the working class, but it's a class element. And I think a left that mainly thinks in these terms of, settler colonialism and so on, will kind of help to contain that kind of dispute, and will have logically, have together or like to join forces behind organization like Hamas. And we know what Hamas did internally. I'm not saying like it's a state force as compared to the Israeli state, but it's a state force. They manage taxes. They have an armed wing. They have a political class. They organize the welfare on a different scale, but it's a class force. They suppressed trade unions. They suppressed working class protests against, the national authority and austerity measures. So, but from your kind of national liberation logic, you would have to kind of gather behind them. And in all other regions, these forces are under attack now. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the movement was against it. So the only situation where it's kind of locked into this kind of, military dispute, only in these situations, organization like Hamas can still survive. They always need the external enemy. And the left is kind of playing into that, saying, yes, we have to take sides here, where we would say we have to take a working class side rather than the national one.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Marco. Arash, are you able to unmute? I try to ask him to unmute. While we, there we go. Arash, can you unmute? Are you able to speak now?
Yes, I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, I had a bit of a problem. So was there a question for me? I've been listening. Sorry, I dropped out a few minutes, but I've been listening. If there was a question, okay, I'm happy to address.
I was just asking Arash about what Moshé described as the recent shift in the left, in which...
Oh, yes, I heard that question.
Yeah,
I heard the question.
Do you want to respond to that?
So I think actually in my initial talk, I actually addressed a bit of that.
Okay, it seems we're having a little bit of technical issues with Arash, but hopefully we can come back to him in a moment. I guess, Yoav and Marco, I wanted to address kind of, and maybe Marco, you can speak to this as well, which is the issue of the left in the UK and in the US, and in Germany and everywhere else in the West, that it seems like we're at a period after the collapse of the Corbyn movement and the DSA Bernie Sanders movement, which largely, didn't address what might be called international issues, and that there is perhaps a sense of being lost on the left in the aftermath of that. And that solidarity with Palestine is one thing everyone can kind of fall back on. And it seems like the question of independent working class politics is, a complicated one for the Middle East, but it also seems to be an unsolvable problem for the left in the US and Germany and the UK. How do you think, and oftentimes it seems like different leftists' various positions when it comes to foreign conflicts such as Israel-Palestine are often oriented towards advising either Labour or the Democrats to change their policy in this way or that. So, which wouldn't be a kind of independent politics. I wonder how you see changes in the Western left at the moment kind of manifesting in this issue somehow.
Shall I begin?
Sure, Yoav, you can go ahead.
All right, thanks. Look, in the United States, the left that you talk about, we'll call it the Sanders movement, okay, has tied itself with the biggest fight today in the world, and that's the climate crisis, with the Green New Deal. And they managed to bring that to the national arena with the Green New Deal because they turned the fight for the climate, which is going to determine the fate of humankind, no less, with the fight of the working class. And that for, good paying jobs and more rights. I'll tell you the truth, in the United States, it's harder to unionize than in Israel, than for Palestinians in Israel, okay? And they managed to put those things together. And you're saying that it's lost, but Sanders went with Biden. And because he went with Biden, saw that in order to win over Trump, he has to address this, and he made this something very, very critical in his program. It's not called the Green New Deal; it's called Build Back Better. But the point is that it's a new deal. It's as big as the last New Deal of the Roosevelt era that built the union. Well, they built. The union movement built the New Deal, and the New Deal built the union movement that we know today. This is the working class that we know today, that was dismantled in the last 40 years, dismantled by neoliberalism. And now we have a shift. We have a shift that says that as part of the fight against climate change, there's also the fight against tyranny and the fight against fascism, and this is done by enforcing the welfare state, and by the way, moving to that new economy that I was talking about. And so in the United States, this is what's happening, and we take our cue from that. That's why we are proposing here in Israel and Palestine also a Green New Deal, because we see this also as the infrastructure that we can build here something new. The same way that in the United States, they realized they have to build something new. And by the way, they couldn't have done this. And you see now Biden's plan, which is huge. We've never seen anything like that, with government investment in infrastructure and in workers and in everything. And this is done because of the Black Lives Matter movement that attached it into social rights and into civil rights. And so I can talk about unfortunately, and maybe, and on this panel, people who know to talk better than me about what's happening in Britain. In Britain, unfortunately, Corbyn was the same type of the left that was against the Arab Spring. It was with the Assad regime. He went with Hezbollah that fights for the Assad regime, and it's kind of the traditional left that stayed the same for 60 years, and it failed. Where in the United States it won, in Britain it failed. This is the way that I see both of those. And obviously we are going with the United States at this point, because there you have the really democratic winds that are blowing from the Arab Spring to the United States, and inshallah here to Israel and Palestine as well.
Okay, Yoav, thank you very much. Marco, we're going to give you the last word here as we wrap up. It seems like you would maybe consider that to be capitalist democratic politics.
No, I would think you can't detach the original New Deal from, you know, the rearmament in the run-up to the Second World War, and you can't detach Biden's kind of deficit spending from his more and more aggressive politics towards China. I mean, these things go hand in hand. It's a kind of protectionist measure in a world crisis, where obviously, you know, you spend more on you know, infrastructure, but in the end, yeah, it's part of I think, yeah, a system that is in crisis and will recreate national disputes and more tension nowadays, mainly with China. So I think you can't detach that. The other point is like the question of, you know, the you know, Corbyn left and so on. I think you have to make it a bit wide, and so you could start with the 21st century socialism, you know, the various kind of national strategies from Venezuela to, you know, Bolivia, which failed. I mean, particularly, for example, in Brazil. And I think there again, this kind of idea that, you know, with the PT or with Lula, that the left has something to offer on that level of, you know, nation state politics, basically brought us Bolsonaro, because people got fed up with the left that is basically can't deliver. And I think similar things would have happened in the UK if Corbyn would have won. You know, they would have said, working class, please wait. Don't put your demands forward because we are under, you know, international pressure. You know, we try to implement like some reforms and basically undermine their own base, you know, which is, you know, supposed to be the working class base. So we've seen that in the failings of the 21st century socialism. I think we see it here. I think that in that sense, parliamentary left is in a deeper crisis and just have to hold on to old kind of, you know, ideological point of views. And then you end up, you know, with, you know, re-emergence of, you know, Stalinism amongst young people, tankies, kind of, you know, anti-imperialism out of that crisis, because, you know, this electoral road failed. So you grab the next thing, which is like the old truth. So at the moment, I think the left is not equipped to understand the working class much further. If you look at movements in Chile or in other places, you know, they question, you know, the representative official democracy much more than the left. So the left is lagging behind there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Marco. Well, thanks for everyone who stuck with us right to the end. Unfortunately, we lost Moshé and then Arash, but I think we had a good discussion, both about the present and about history. If you'd like to find out more about the Platypus Affiliated Society, you can visit our website, platypus1917.org. The Angry Workers World also has a website and has recently published a book, which you should check out. Yoav and Dam also have a website, if you Google Dam, and I encourage you to check it out. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and we hope to see you at panel events in person as well in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thanks.